public education. And first of all, it startled me. I had to think a minute, and I said, well, sir, I don't really see it that way. I said, when I first got here, one of the first people that came to see me was a representative from a private university who came down and said, please don't cut the scholarships, the need-based scholarships for students to go to private universities. And I said, oh, don't worry. We've got Gardner-Webb in Cleveland County, Belmont Abbey in Gaston. I said, that's fine. We're going to support those private universities. And then I told the gentleman, I said, sir, I was not sworn in until 2011, but before 2011, it was my understanding that the people in charge actually furloughed teachers. And I said, to the best of my research, since 2011, when we took charge of the General Assembly, we've not furloughed a single teacher, as far as I know. Nobody's proven me wrong on that. And then I started to tell him that, you know, I do support school choice, and I mentioned to him that according to my research, Democrats were actually in charge of the state Senate when public charter schools became legal, and had some bit of control after that, could have eliminated public charter schools, but chose not to. So that's another school choice issue that's been important to me. Another piece of analysis that I told him was that since we got here, we've passed numerous pay raises for teachers and state employees, while at the same time cutting their income taxes, where, as in the past, they used to give a nominal raise, but they would also match it with a pretty significant tax increase. We chose not to raise income taxes on the very people who we just provided a raise for. Some other things that we've invested quite a bit of money on for public schools would be safety measures and capital, something that I know most of the people on this side of the aisle are proud of. Another little instance of something that we did, we studied the liability insurance costs for what it would cost per FTE, and so someone wouldn't have to join an association to get liability insurance. And we discovered that we could actually pay for that liability insurance for about, at that time, roughly, I think it was $16 or $17 per person. That's close to a $400 per year savings into a teacher's pocket. It's pretty significant where I come from. So the last thing I think I would mention is when we first got here, or when I first got here in 2011, we inherited a massive budget shortfall. We were coming out of a tough economy. I forget how many billions of a structural deficit we had. And the executive branch at that time, we had divided government then, the executive branch floated the idea of balancing the budget on the backs of teachers and state employees' retirement fund. And if I recollect correctly, I think Republicans stood and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to continue to honor that contractual obligation, fund their retirement system, not let you balance the budget on the teachers and state employees' backs. And so my hometown, where I live now, Cherryville, we don't have to worry about it much. There are not any really close charter schools. Private schools are very far off. They can go to a school in Gastonia called the Highland School of Technology, but that's public. So we don't have a real problem with it in Cherryville, but a lot of other people still comment to me about it. So I just wanted to put it on record today for the people back home, just what we've done for public education when a lot of the public seems to get into rhetoric about how we've dismantled public education, which it couldn't be further from the truth. And so I just wanted to kind of straighten out the record today just a little bit, and thanks for your time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Mecklenburg, Representative Autry, rise?
To debate the conference report.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it should come as no surprise to you all that I have grandchildren. I have some young grandchildren that are still in school, public school. You see, my grandchildren's parents exercised their school choice. They chose to put their children in public school, where they just happen to be excelling. I mean, the third grader does fourth grade math. Now, if the state funded our public schools at the same percentage of the general fund that they did in 1971 when I graduated from high school in North Carolina, there would be another $3 billion in the general fund for our public schools. So, at the dinner table at my children's home, the discussion centers around when is this state going to step up and support their school choice? Shameful.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Cumberland, Representative Lucas, rise?
To speak to the conference report.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard a lot of rhetoric about the provisions in this conference report. I am particularly appalled at the section on education. You see, I'm a product of the public schools of North Carolina, and probably most of you are too. I served in the public schools for 33 years, retired there. One can get an excellent education in public schools provided that we make the provisions for excellency. Whenever we deprive those schools, we're going to get diminishing returns. I don't know of any child that I'm willing to throw away. Sending money to private schools is fine as long as we don't take it from the public schools. We owe it to them. Public schools are compulsory and they are free, or supposed to be. Whenever we subtract the resources from these schools, and I will say that very religiously. As I said, I've been around here a long time. I've yet to find a child that I'd like to throw away. Maybe you have. I haven't. I'm ashamed to say that we're going to diminish our public schools for the sake of those who can afford to do what they're doing already, going to private schools. I have no problem with that. Let them go if they can afford that. But our obligation still remains to those kids who, for whatever reason, bad parents, no parents, reluctant parents who don't see the need to get involved in their children's education to see that they can extract the very best that they can be, we owe it to them as public officials. I have no problem voting no on this provision. I would like to vote yes on some of the other provisions in that, but it's a conference report, so I don't have that option. Please, please remember these children. If you don't look out for them now, as the old commercial goes, you're going to pay it later.
For what purpose does the lady from Orange, Representative Price, rise?
Speak to the conference report.
Lady has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to say a few words, in some points echoing what my colleagues have already said. But with regard to the Opportunity Scholarship Funds, essentially none of these funds will be going to help the people, the children and the young people of Caswell County, which is a rural Tier 1 county. Already the teachers are getting less than teachers in other counties because the economy of that county just will not support paying a decent supplement to the teachers, but yet they still are dedicated to their students and they will teach. In Orange County, the situation is somewhat similar, but we have families that are even struggling, well, in both counties, struggling to pay for the school supplies that the children need in their classrooms. And so, and in some cases, even food. I mean, having to provide breakfast and lunch to these students. And so I just urge us to consider, again, putting more money into our traditional public school system. And I believe that we have both a statutory and a moral obligation to support our traditional public schools. And another point I want to make about this is that according to the Public School Forum of North Carolina, over 90% of the funds are going to religious schools. And while I have nothing against sending children to religious schools, I do believe in the separation of church and state, and again, supporting our traditional public schools. And then I do want to say one point about ICE. I'm concerned about putting the burden on our local law enforcement, an unfunded mandate. And also, it seems to, the way that this is being perceived in our communities is that it has less to do with law enforcement and more to do with fear-mongering against people that look differently. And so I'd urge us to please remember that this is a nation of immigrants, and this nation was built and developed by the intelligence and the skills and on the backs of immigrants. Thank you, and please vote against this conference report.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Caldwell, Representative Hall, rise?
To debate the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the debate that I've heard today is not one that deals with the ICE bill at all. We've been working on this now for 5 years. It's passed multiple committees in this chamber, multiple committees in the Senate. It's passed both the House and the Senate. It's been worked on. It's been changed. We've worked with the Sheriff's Association over time, and the product is what you see before you today. But what's been described is nothing that's in this bill. And so it's important to keep in mind that in this bill, we're only talking about folks who are not only just here illegally, but that they've also been charged with a serious crime in our state. So murder, rape, other violent crimes, not driving without a license, which I often hear from folks. They say, well, these folks have to work, they got to drive. Well, this bill has nothing to do with that, because driving without a license is not a felony, it's not a violent crime. So again, it's when folks are charged with a violent crime, meaning law enforcement's taken them in front of a disinterested third-party judicial official, usually a magistrate, and that person has found probable cause that that individual had committed a serious crime. And so then they go into the jail, just like you or I would if we committed a serious crime. And so up until 2018, what would happen then if ICE, which enforces federal immigration law, if they wanted to take possession of that person, as is their right under federal law, and there are federal laws that are supposed to enforce immigration in our country, if they want to take that person, they use an ICE detainer. And until 2018, every sheriff in this state cooperated with ICE. And what a detainer does, it just simply says that you can hold the person for up to 48 hours until ICE takes the hold of them, and if ICE doesn't do it, you got to let them go. And I can tell you, after working on this bill for a long time and talking to probably over half of the sheriffs in this state, rarely does it take ICE 48 hours to pick someone up. When they issue a detainer request, it's usually the same day they come and pick them up. And that's because ICE is focusing on the folks who are not just here illegally, but also committing crimes in our country. Folks who have been convicted of crimes before, folks who have been deported before. They're trying to get those folks. It's not that they're out rounding folks up, going into a workplace and just taking a bunch of people out of there. That's not happening. It's certainly not happening under the current administration. And if you talk to any law enforcement officer, whether it's ICE, whether it's county sheriff, police, you name it, they'll tell you one of the most dangerous things that they do is serve any sort of process. So they're serving a warrant or serving an ICE detainer. And that's because they're going into an uncontrolled environment and they're taking custody of someone who usually doesn't want to have custody of themselves taken. We saw a tragic example of that in Charlotte several months back. In that case, the law enforcement, federal and state law enforcement, were trying to serve a warrant, and the result was multiple law enforcement officers killed on the scene. Now, again, that's because they're going out into an uncontrolled environment to take custody of somebody under the law, just like ICE does with ICE detainers. And if you ask the folks at ICE, because again, I have, they'll tell you, we would much prefer to do our job that federal law requires them to do in the controlled environment of a jail. They don't want to go out into the neighborhood. They don't want to go into a workplace where they don't know who has a weapon, who's going to run, who's going to try to attack somebody, who's going to hurt somebody. They want to focus their attention on folks who are committing crimes and folks who are in a jail. Now that makes sense. That's common sense, right? We don't want law enforcement to get hurt. We don't want bystanders to get hurt. We don't even want the people who are being detained to get hurt. We just want the law to be followed. And the job of law enforcement is to keep public safety. And again, that's why until 2018, every sheriff already did what this bill requires. They did it voluntarily. They weren't required to cooperate with ICE because they did cooperate with ICE. Common sense. And then, of course, in 2018, a handful of sheriffs got elected and decided they just simply wouldn't communicate with ICE at all. And that's happening in this state today. There are somewhere probably fewer than 10 sheriffs who literally will not communicate with ICE. That meaning 90 plus sheriffs in this state, they don't care if this bill passes or not, they're already going to cooperate. And again, the North Carolina Sheriff's Association has endorsed this provision in the bill. But what have we seen as a result of the handful of sheriffs who don't cooperate? Well, there's example after example after example. The folks at ICE, when I first started working on this, sent me a long list of examples in this state of people who had ICE detainers lodged on them, they were in jails, the sheriff let them go, and they went back out to reoffend. You know, one of the most famous cases was in Mecklenburg County, where a lady was assaulted, beaten. The person who offended against her was arrested, several domestic violence-related charges, felony kidnapping, and that person was taken to the jail. They were also here illegally, and ICE lodged a detainer on that person. Well, they met bond, and they walked out of the jail because the sheriff let them walk out. And then that same person went back to reoffend against that same victim. And this time it took about a 7-hour standoff with CMPD to take that person back into custody. When all the sheriff had to do was cooperate with ICE, honor the detainer, and that person wouldn't have gone on to reoffend. And so I've heard throughout the debate today about this being a moral issue, about this tearing at the fabric of our society. Well, I don't know where that lady's at today who was offended and who was assaulted and who was kidnapped, but I bet you she agrees that this is a moral issue and that tears at the fabric of our society. Just maybe not the way you think about it. I think she would have preferred not to have been assaulted and not to have been kidnapped. And I think all victims of crime who have dealt with this very issue would feel the same way. And so this puts an end to the insanity that we've seen since 2018. ICE detainers have been around since the 50s. And I've also heard a lot of comments about this being unconstitutional and what a liability it is to sheriffs across the state. Well, that's news to the sheriffs across the state because, again, 90 plus are already cooperating with them. Overwhelmingly, state and federal courts have said ICE detainers are constitutional. Obviously, it's the federal government's job to enforce immigration law. And just like every other area of the law, state and local law enforcement cooperate with federal authorities to enforce the law and to keep the public safe. This issue's never been more important than it is today. And the reason why is because under the current administration, President Biden, Vice President Harris, who's the border czar, we don't have a border. And the reality is, in the last almost 4 years, millions and millions of folks have streamed across the southern border in this country. And these are not just folks from Central, South America, These are folks from China, folks from the Middle East. In June, the FBI Task Force on Terrorism located 8 people who had ties to ISIS. They were on the terror watch list. And ICE, coincidentally, was the group that went out, lodged detainers, and picked those folks up. That's one example. That was just this June. You can Google it. There's example after example of folks with terrorist ties coming into this country, crossing the southern border, and nobody's doing anything about it. And the only way in this state that this body can do anything about it is to make sure that at least our local law enforcement, when they come into contact with somebody, again, who's committed a serious crime and has been charged with such by a third-party magistrate, that they'll at least cooperate with ICE. So I hope you'll support this bill. We've heard a lot today about what the folks of this, the majority of the people in this state support. I promise you, the people of this state believe that those who are here illegally and committing crimes, that we should be cooperating with ICE. It's the best thing for our state in public safety. It has nothing to do with going out and rounding people up. And I also ask you to remember, no matter what we do on this bill, the federal government has to enforce immigration law. And ICE has a job to do. And if we don't let them do it in local jails, they've got to go out in these same communities. And I always find it odd when I hear the small handful of sheriffs say, well, you know, we're not going to do that in our community. We're just not going to cooperate with ICE. Well, that's great, because then what happens is ICE goes out into their community. They go out to the workplace, and again, we have to go right back to the situation of going into an unknown situation, going out into neighborhoods, and them going out to do their job because they've got to do it. I'm glad that we're finally at the point where this bill is going to become law pretty soon. In my opinion, many of those sheriffs who are not cooperating, I think they want us to pass this, because many of them are career law enforcement, and they know it makes no sense at all to do what they're doing. And so we're going to help them out. The other thing I've heard about the bill today is that we've got all of these things in it, and lo and behold, this is a conference report, and we're arguing about procedure. Well, I remind you that everything in this conference report today, not just House Bill 10, but the opportunity scholarships and every other provision, has already passed this body and has already passed the Senate. So for those listening at home and confused about what a conference report may be, you may want to remind them that the reason all these things are in here is we've already passed them all through both chambers. Now we're just putting them in one bill so that we can make them all become law. We've debated this ICE bill for 5 years in committee after committee, in body after body between the House and Senate. We've debated opportunity scholarships through committee after committee and body after body, as are the other provisions in this bill. The time for debate is over with. It is clear that these bills have, the provisions of this bill have majority support, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to be recognized for a motion.
The gentleman is recognized for a motion.
Mr. Speaker, I move the previous question.
The gentleman has moved the previous question to House Bill 10. The motion is non-debatable. The chair will point out there were about an equal number of lights on both sides of the chamber. So the question before the House is the motion to adopt the previous question on House Bill 10. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will open the vote. Bell, aye. Clerk will lock the machine and record the vote. 67 having voted in the affirmative, 43 in the negative. The previous question is adopted. The question before the House is the adoption of the conference report to House Bill 10. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will open the vote.
Mr. Speaker.
Remember, there's no 3 minutes on the conference report. That's second and third. But yes, sir. I should have said that before I opened the vote. But so the vote is open. A few members haven't cast, so the vote is open. Make sure everybody gets their vote counted. Representative Eiler, Representative Cleveland, Representative Shepard. Get the Onslow guys back voting there instead of talking. Looks like everyone's voted. Clerk will lock the machine and record the vote. 67 haven't voted in the affirmative and 43 in the negative. The conference report to House Bill 10 is adopted. The bill is ordered and rolled, sent to the governor by a special messenger. For what purpose, the gentleman from Durham, Representative Hawkins, rise. Appointments to standing committees. The clerk will read.
The Speaker makes the following committee appointments. Representative Clark is appointed to Commerce, Appropriations, Education, Education, Community Colleges, and Education Universities. Representative Ryan is appointed to Appropriations, Education K-12, Appropriations, Education, Health, and Local Government.
Noted, and Senate will be so notified as well. Members, the chair is going to ask for a motion to suspend the rules relative to one provision. In Rule 2, as you all know, when the House convenes, even if it's a pro forma session, we will generally do the prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance before that, even if we are going to be later coming back in that day for a vote, just like we did today. And we had suspended that rule to allow in those instances where the pro forma would be done early in the day, but when we were coming back in later in the day for a vote, to wait and do the prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance at that time. The chair thought we had done that for the remainder of the legislative session, but we had apparently only done it for that last special session. So the chair would ask without objection, any objection to suspending that rule, so that for the balance of this year through the end of this, before we sine die, that rule be suspended. Any objection? Any questions on that? I hear an objection. That will be so ordered. The gentleman from Wayne, Representative Bell, is recognized for an announcement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we had, with the resignation of Representative Sane, our caucus held elections for the position of Republican Conference Chair, and Representative Matthew Winslow was elected to that position. So, so this is, I guess, Mr. White, this is official notice that Representative Matthew Winslow